Hello and welcome to the LLA's Revolution series. It's my pleasure to welcome you and introduce this first session of the new series. Many of you will be familiar with the presenter today, Kevin. Kevin brought us the previous 12 sessions about Labour's history, extremely enjoyable and available on YouTube. So without further ado, please get your popcorn and pitchforks ready, comrades, for the Peasants' Revolt. Over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Good evening, comrades, or good morning if you're in another time zone. This evening's session is about peasant and radical movements in the period from the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And it's the first part of a number of talks which will go on up into December on the idea of turning points and key moments in socialist history. And we've got a very good program which covers a real range of topics: the English Revolution, the American Revolutionary tradition, obviously the French Revolution, and then key moments in the 19th century development of revolutionary ideas, and of course the creation of some of the world's first working class movements, the Paris Commune, the world's first workers' government, and so on. I'm doing a number of the sessions, but we've also got other speakers as well, and I'm happy to say that we've managed to get John Rees, who's recently written a well-received book on the Levellers, to talk next week about the Levellers and the Diggers in the English Revolution. So we've also got a number of other comrades who've written on these topics. Rob Seal, for example, is speaking on the 5th of November on Chartism. And then we've got some of our own activists, such as Alec Price, talking on the Paris Commune, and also a comrade from the United States, Dan Lazare, who's going to talk about the American Revolutionary tradition and what he calls the Second American Revolution, the American Civil War, and the struggle against slavery, which, given the present controversy about Black Lives Matter and indeed our relationship to history, I think will be a very interesting set of sessions. So I'm actually looking forward to doing these sessions, and as Ben said at the beginning, really each session will consist of an introduction, and then it will be followed by sort of questions and discussion and contributions from the floor, as it were. What I hope for my sessions as well, I hope, more than hope, what I will produce for my sessions are a number of readings. I'm still coming to terms with the technology, but I have got a number of texts and primary materials that would be useful. And I also intend, again, with my sessions, and I think some other comrades will do this as well, to do 1 or 2 supplementary follow-up recorded sessions. I think the grandiose title is a podcast, but I'm not sure whether they really come into that category or not. So, for example, following up from this evening, I will be doing a little more detailed discussion on 3 topics. The whole idea of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the idea of the nation state, which is very important in some of the things that we're going to talk about, the development of that, and then of course the idea of the Reformation and the role of religion in this period. So I hope that you'll all get something out of it, and as ever, as they used to say when I was at university anyway, that a seminar or discussion is a pooling of ignorance. And I hope that comrades will fill in any gaps that I've left, and indeed any sort of knowledge of their own. It's really an attempt to sort of collectively educate ourselves. Okay, I wondered where to begin this series, and could, for example, have started in the classical world with the slave revolt of Spartacus. Indeed, that's probably one of the best known movements of the plebeian classes, of the lower classes in history, and it was a great inspiration to socialists. It has produced a novel. It's produced other books. It, of course, produced in Germany the Spartakusbund, Spartacus, the idea of the slave revolt, has been a great inspiration. I could even have gone back further and looked at struggles in the Roman Republic between patricians and plebeians. And indeed, in terms of looking at ideas, a comrade reminded me the other day that there is evidence not only in the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular, but also in other writings from Mesopotamia of ideas that we could now represent, or that could be represented as socialistic or egalitarian. So that might actually be an interesting point to start about where we can think of socialism as actually beginning. Some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today, I don't think really clearly come into that category. But what they have done is to act as an inspiration for later socialists and members of the working class movement. And it's that, I think, that I want to try to get us to think about, but maybe in some ways to recapture some of the spirit of these movements, and to see ourselves and our movement as part of a very long history by working people, by rural people, peasants in the technical sense. I know in English that sometimes has a pejorative meaning, but it's a social categorization. Peasant, someone who works on the land, who's connected to the land. I want us to try and sort of understand our relationship to the past of our movement, partly, I think, to sort of get a sense of our own history, but also to understand the differences of those movements, and also, in a sense, to look at some of the lessons from them. I think even a movement in the medieval period, has something to teach us. Also, I think that one of the things that we as activists in the contemporary labour movement must be really aware of is that many people who join the labour movement, join the trade unions, become active in socialist politics, often have a very dim appreciation or understanding of not only their own history as a movement, but also in the wider sense, the development of capitalism as a system, the pre-capitalist formations, and indeed that great sweep of human history. And certainly when I first became involved in the labour movement, it was that sort of sense of being part of a long struggle that I found very important. In the 60s and the 70s, people were increasingly interested in movements like this, particularly in the English Revolution. And, for many people, these were inspirations. And certainly when I was at school and when I was at university, reading the writings of the levelers and the diggers, reading about these movements, was certainly an inspiration to me and to other people. So that's some of my thinking about this. So let's now try and turn to look at these movements and try and put them in some context. I've chosen two movements really to look at, but I could have chosen really quite a host of other movements. And indeed, in preparing for tonight's talk, when I began to look, I noticed that there was a series of movements in this period that I could have chosen. I've chosen two countries which have been most extensively written about, but that's only because I think that they were given attention in the socialist movement. But we could, for example, look at movements in Central Europe, such as the Hussite movement in Bohemia. We could look at movements in the Low Countries, it's a rather old-fashioned phrase, modern-day Belgium, in Flanders, in Ghent and in Bruges. We could look at peasant movements even as far back as the 800s, 900s in Normandy. We could look at similar movements in northern Spain. So much of what I'm talking about here are really examples, I think, of other movements where the historical record is perhaps more limited. But with these two movements that I'm going to focus on, the English Peasant Revolt and the German Peasants' War, we've got you know, a degree of evidence and a degree of familiarity about them. Also, these two movements were movements that very clearly impressed the earlier socialists. Friedrich Engels wrote a book on the German Peasant War, which he wrote in 1850. And he very much wrote that in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions. And you could see from his writing that not only was he attempting to sort of use the Marxist method, which he and Marx were developing, particularly in an understanding of the relationship between the development of productive forces and political movements, but he was also, in a sense, looking at what had happened in their own revolution in 1848-49, and in a sense trying to look at the way a similar pattern had developed in the 1520s in Germany. And likewise, the Peasants' Revolt inspired later thinkers and writers. Thomas Paine, for example, in his famous debates with Edmund Burke, argued that there should, rather than have statues to royalty and to great leaders, that one of the best memorials London can have in Smithfield would be that of Wat Tyler, one of the leaders of the Peasant Revolt. We still haven't managed to achieve that, so if there are any competitions for statues around, then I would certainly recommend a statue of Wat Tyler in Smithfield. And of course that inspired too Chartists. There was a Wat Tyler Brigade of the Chartist movement, and of course William Morris, in his one of his famous sort of socialist fantasy books, The Dream of John Ball, tried to give us a feel for how medieval people looked at the world, but also at its relevance for 19th century socialism. So I want to try and talk about what these movements, try to understand where they come from, and try in a way to put them into some sort of context of their time. First of all, the English Peasants' Revolt, which occurs in 1381, is a movement which I think people are perhaps aware of to a certain extent. The main outline of events are that there was a rising of the rural population, but it also included some townspeople in Essex, initially in Essex, then later in Kent. The movement does seem to have spread further into East Anglia, and indeed some of the evidence is other parts of England had supplementary risings that followed on from this. Now, I want to be clear about the nature of a peasant, or indeed the nature of feudalism. I think, again, we're all familiar with the images of feudalism. Popular culture has given us a picture of oppression, of barbarity, and of general oppression. And although those things are true, certainly by the middle of the 14th century, the condition of the rural population, particularly the masses of that rural population, weren't as clearly defined as that. So, for example, in the more economically developed parts of England, Kent and Essex and in East Anglia, the type of feudal serfdom that we're familiar with had evolved and developed considerably, so that, for example, there was production for the market in London, and indeed the peasant population often was either tenanted, was either renting land, or indeed in some cases was starting to acquire land ownership as well. So what we have then in those areas is a developing rural economy. And of course, in that sort of situation, that gives a degree of bargaining power to the rural population. There were other elements as well that were bringing change. The impact of the Black Death, again in the 1340s, was still felt as late as the 1380s. That had possibly devastated as much as a third of the population. And of course, that again gave something of a whip hand to those who were employed or those in a subservient position. Indeed, so much of an issue was there that in 1349, an act was passed to try and prevent not only combinations of workmen and of serfs and of peasants, but also to try and maintain wages at a low level, because workers had been in a position to actually bargain for wages in a period of labour shortage. So the feudal system that we know of, based on landholding, on labour service of people holding land in return for work or for other forms of service or payment, this was undergoing something of a transformation, and particularly in those developed areas. Now, what we also have, I think, are attempts by landowners, the aristocracy, the feudal aristocracy, to recoup their position. We do have something of a sort of counter-revolution, as it were, a feudal reaction, to sort of try and regain their position, and in particular to reimpose some of the more restrictive elements of feudal control. Now, many of these could be commuted for money, so labour service could be commuted in that way. But many of these restrictions were irksome, and they were also a reminder that the mass of the population was still technically in a form of servitude. They were still in a form of control by the aristocracy. So although many of the peasants that we're talking about would have had relative security, and indeed were much better off than previous generations, they were also subject to many feudal restrictions, as we might imagine. And so you've got that particular tension. You've also got a set, I think, of political and other changes. There have been a series of wars between England and France. The 100 Years' War, not quite 100 years, but it does cover that very rough period. And that, of course, necessitated taxation. And of course, the poll tax and other taxes were levied on the rural population. They fell unduly on the poor. And so again, you had attempts to attack the living standards of peasants in that way. And of course, there were other elements as well. And this is again where I think we start to move towards the ideological. This sort of sense that the ruling class was not adequately defending the population in the southern counties as a result of the war. Not only had many people gone off to fight in those wars in France, but also the southern coast was subject to attack by the French. So we have a certain degree of political discontent. The king, Richard II, is relatively young. He's around about 14, I think, at this point. And so he's a relatively young, inexperienced king. 14 in the Middle Ages would not necessarily have been a child. He would have been on the edge of adulthood. And indeed, we'll see how he behaves, that he was relatively adult in defending his interest. But it was often seen as a sort of a weakness, and indeed the idea of aristocratic factions and of leading aristocrats sort of exploiting the situation was also part of the political sense at this time. I want to talk a little bit about this in terms of sort of consciousness and understanding, because one of the things, again, that it's very easy for us to perhaps sort of misinterpret, misunderstand, is the level of consciousness and indeed the understanding that the population has of its position in the world. We know from various literature, we know from various accounts, that there is a popular culture. We can only really see the tip of it expressed in certain sayings, in some literature, some poetry, and so on, which expresses discontent, and in particular a sense that the existing social order isn't right. Now, you can understand that, of course, can't you? That, you know, people who live fairly poor lives can see the difference between themselves and the elites. You can see that people would, you know, would be discontented. But I think we have to understand why at particular moments a movement breaks out. Because, of course, this discontent and these social issues had, you know, been in existence for centuries. And I suppose here we start to look at maybe some of the mechanisms that might lead to an outbreak of a particular movement. And I've indicated the problems of taxation. I've indicated some of the political issues. I've also indicated some of the economic context. And you can see that for people to do something about that, to rise in revolt, there has to be, I suppose, in a sense, some sort of underlying ideology, because what we have here are not just sort of outbreaks. For example, in France in the 1350s, 1358, I think to 59, there was a peasant movement, the Jacquerie, which in many ways was just a sort of a fairly spontaneous uprising that sort of ran amok, and indeed was almost a sort of elemental expression of rage and anger. And I suppose we have to look at the difference between that and this movement, because one of the things about the Peasants' Revolt, as will be the case with the German Peasants' War, is there's a degree of organization. There's also a degree of ideology, and that ideology is expressed in religious language. And the title of the talk, When Adam Delved and Eve Span, Who Was Then the Gentleman, is a line taken from one of John Bull's sermons, allegedly. But that phrase and that type of idea of, in the past, in the Garden of Eden, that there was a primitive period when we were all equal, that there was no ownership of property, and that sort of idea of going back to Christian ideology, using religion as a way of explaining the world, was part of the dominant ideology of the time, but it was also a way that people tried to express an alternative to the society that they lived in. So I think what is interesting here is to try and look at that ideology, and not just to see this as a sort of spontaneous revolt that you know, there's bloodshed and so on. It does have some clear ideological aims. So I'll just sort of sketch out the very rough pattern of events. In late May 1381, there are some attacks upon tax gatherers. Again, we think probably the first one is in the village of Bobbing in Essex, but this movement spreads throughout Essex and then also over the River Thames down into North Kent. And groups of peasants organize themselves. They organize themselves around local sort of districts. The county divisions at that point are called hundreds. And they form what are essentially sort of peasant bands, which then move in an organized way to confront symbols of oppression. For example, they attack some of the big houses. They try to destroy manorial records where the various records of land ownership and feudal obligations are held. And in some cases, they capture castles, such as at Rochester, and they also take leading members of the aristocracy prisoner. They gather together in their forces, and then they attempt to march on London. Now, what's interesting with the march on London is, you know, what the aim of this is. Now, this is clearly, you know, an insurrection, but what's the point of it? And it's here, I think, that we can see this problem of ideology and maybe of consciousness. What the rebels appear to want to do is to carry out a purge of the corrupt elements who lead society. So they want to, for example, remove some of the evil advisors, the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They behead the Archbishop of Canterbury. They burn down some of the important buildings owned by the aristocracy in London. But they don't have, I suppose, a clear alternative vision of what sort of society they want. So when they march to London, the numbers in the chronicles are given often as 50 or 60,000 people, probably an exaggeration, but certainly groups of 10, 15,000 or so. They go in towards the eastern part of London. There are two sort of encampments, one at Blackheath, which is in southeast London, and then the other one over at Smithfield. And at Smithfield, the king and the rebels confront each other. Now, what's interesting in their first meeting is that the boy king Richard hands them some banners. He says, "You will be my faithful subjects, and I will right your abuses. I will try to, I will try to improve things." So, what Richard does is, in a sense, trade on their loyalty. Now, these are an armed group who have, confronting the king. They're confronting the very rudimentary state. There are more of them than any army that the king can get together immediately. So he's in a very weak position. But he also trades upon the fact that their ideology is not for some sort of socialist transformation of society. It sees that there's something wrong in the world, and that the way that that world can be put right is if the king is brought to his attention. And this again shows something of the ideology is often quite conservative in the sense of looking back to a feudal order in which the lords and the ruling class behave properly, in which they do their duty to protect the peasant, and in turn the peasant is treated properly, and he will then do his duty to the lord in this way. So this ideology is still, it's developed. It's very clearly based upon our ideas of Christianity and reciprocity. It's also based upon a conservative idea of the nature of the feudal order. So what the peasants as a group are unable to do is to really imagine any other society other than their own. They can only imagine a society that would be an improvement. It would be essentially the same society, but it would be run properly, really following the feudal ideal, the Christian ideal. If you want to get an idea of that, William Langland's poem, The Vision of Piers Plowman, which reflects many of these things from that time, picks up on this, particularly of Piers Plowman as a sort of embodiment of the peasant, who in a sense is the basis of society. And indeed he is. Without the work of serfs and so forth, then the society won't function. Now, the second phase, of course, is when Richard appears again. He again goes into discussion with the rebel leaders, in particular Wat Tyler, and in the course of that discussion, on the second day, the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, stabs Tyler, kills him, and that there is then a sort of a standoff. Now, of course, if the peasants had been a clear revolutionary group, had been able to rise above their situation, they would have seen the king and his nobles, doing what they'd done as in fact an attack upon their movement. But Richard relied upon the fact that they still saw the king as the person who could deal with their grievances. And of course, again, we perhaps all know this from school days. Richard rides into the crowd and says, "I will be your leader, and then the peasant movement is calmed, and they then disperse, and in effect the movement is over. Many of the leaders are hunted down. There's a period of repression, and so the movement dissipates. So, in many senses, an episode, but it is an inspiring episode, and one that was to inspire many people, much later on. Just to give you a flavour of that, and again, I will put this up on the website. The most famous account of this by Jean Froissart, the French chronicler, gives a speech to John Ball, one of the leaders of the movement, possibly a former priest, and connected to what will be the Lollard movement, John Wycliffe's movement for religious reform. And this is just a little reading from Ball's words, which are quite famous, and again, where many people have taken inspiration. Are ye good people? The matter goeth not well to pass in England, nor shall do till everything be common, and that there be no villeins nor gentlemen, but that we all be united together, and that the lords be no greater masters than we be. What have we deserved, or why should we be kept thus in servage or in servitude? We come from one father and one mother, Adam and Eve. Whereby can they say or show that they be greater lords than we be, saving be that they cause us to win and labour for what they dispend? They are clothed in velvet and camlet, furred with grease, and we can be vestured with poor cloth. They have their wines, spices, and good bread, and we have the drawing out of the chaff and drink water. They dwell in fair houses, and we have the pain and the travail, rain and wind in the fields. And by that cometh out of our labours, they keep and maintain their estates. We be called their bondmen, and without we do them readily service. We will be beaten. And we have no sovereign to whom we may complain, nor that we will hear us nor do us right. Let us go to the king, he is young, and show him what service we be in, and show him how we shall have it otherwise, or else we will provide us of some remedy. And if we go together, all manner of people that now be in any bondage will follow us to the intent to be made free. And when the king seeth us, we shall have some remedy, either by fairness or otherwise. And that speech, I think, captures some of the points I was making. I now just want to turn to the events in Germany, which actually occurred much later, but they do have some common elements in them. Also, we're in a rather different period. We're in a different country as well. Germany, as a single unified state, doesn't exist. It's a series of principalities, and it's a series of jurisdictions. Indeed, exactly where Germany is at this point is not clear. Much of the peasants' revolt actually takes place in what is nowadays eastern France. It also extends into what is now Austria and down into northern Italy, as well as up into central Germany and into the modern day Czech Republic. But there are some similarities. But there are some also very important differences, and in some ways it's a much more effective rising than that of the English peasants. It occurs over essentially a 2-year period, 1524 to 25, but also to a certain extent to 1526 as well. And that movement again has many similar demands and many similar grievances to those that we've heard from the English peasants, particularly the attempt to reimpose feudal restrictions, particularly the attempt at exploitation, and in a sense, given that it's about 150 years later, all of the processes of the dissolution of feudalism, which had been going on in England, are in the same sort of position in Germany. But there are some key differences, and one difference, I suppose, is that by the 1520s, the Reformation is underway in Germany, and that movement is obviously a religious movement, a movement for religious reform, but it's also a political movement very much imbued with ideas of German nationalism, particularly against the idea of the foreigner. So much of the movement in the German peasant movement has really quite explicitly political overtones. It also is much more closely linked to the Reformation and to the demands for fundamental reform in society. The revolt begins in some of the more developed areas of Germany, in southwestern Germany, in the Black Forest area, and there are a series of movements in Swabia. These usually consist of protests about rents and about feudal restrictions, but very quickly these turn into quite large-scale organized movements. So that, for example, peasant movements with bands of peasants numbering 10 or 15,000 are trying to spread the message and to spread the protest throughout southwestern Germany. And what essentially they do is to demand change. They demand an end to feudal restrictions. They demand an end to excessive rents. So the whole series of demands and reforms. Now, what's interesting about these demands is that we have them not only in the form that their opponents noted down, as in the chronicles of Froissart and Walsingham and other people in the English revolt. We've got the actual demands of the peasants themselves, and they're printed. Because, of course, we're now in the era of printing. We're now in the era of what is in many ways mass propaganda. And, of course, what we also have is a very highly developed organization. So that this peasant movement does attempt to get redress of grievances like the English movement did. It, too, negotiates with abbots, with aristocrats, even in some cases with monarchs. But it doesn't just stop at wanting a redress of grievances. It starts to put forward demands of its own. It even, for example, involves the organization of peasant parliaments, taking the models of the estates patterns that you have in the Holy Roman Empire. So it begins to put forward its own political demands. It begins to organize itself. So this movement, which spreads from southwestern Germany, it then goes over in towards up into central Germany, towards Franconia, and then into Thuringia and Saxony. Throughout these years, you have this movement spreading. It even organizes in a modern way, with people setting out from villages as bases, traveling in groups, almost like flying pickets, trying to bring people into the movement. The demands of the movement are both political and economic, and of course religious. And it does become very much entangled with the more radical religious elements in the Reformation. But of course, the mainstream Reformation led by Luther is very dismissive of this movement. Indeed, Luther writes blistering attacks upon it. He's very much on the side of property, very much on the side of the monarchs, of the princes, and he supports the idea that they should be crushed. He calls them the murdering dogs, that they should be suppressed. So we have a high degree of organization, we have a high degree of militancy. We've also got a fairly high degree of consciousness, I think, much higher than would be the case in the English movement. This movement forms its own political organizations, forms its own armies. It has armies of 10 and 15,000 people, and it's in a position to actually go into battle with the armies of the monarchs and the princes. But of course, there are clear weaknesses, and the weakness is, again, I think, simply one of issues of consciousness, and indeed the limited horizons and perspectives of the movement. Let's look first of all at the problem with the organization. The movement was often quite localized. I've talked about it spreading in waves, but the tendency was that once grievances had been dealt with in a particular area, and many of the feudal landlords and others were clever enough to sign treaties and agreements and buy off a group of peasants in that area, and then allow the movement to damp down. So it was often quite regionalized and quite localized in this way. The other problem was, of course, although the idea of assemblies, of gathering in the ring, as it were, the idea of a sort of Landschaft, a sort of parliamentary body, was very strong and clearly in advance of anything which had gone on before, it still was limited because it didn't have, in a sense, an idea of an alternative. There were radicals, and those radicals, which I will just conclude with, those radicals were a small minority, and then they I think, because their vision was very millenarian, it was very much influenced by a theocratic idea. It was really incapable, I suppose, of taking that movement forward. Now, this movement was sufficiently powerful enough for the monarchs to be afraid of it, and when they couldn't, those parts of it that they couldn't buy off, they confronted militarily and were able to defeat it in fairly open battles. So again, serious fighting occurred. So this movement is a serious challenge, but it's its inability, I think, to go beyond the bounds of its own society. Now, Engels wrote about this, and I suppose, for those of us from the Marxist tradition, we're quite interested in how we looked at this. And he suggested that, in a way, the material conditions of the peasants, the level of productive resources and so forth, meant that, in a way, they were trapped in that worldview, that they could, in a sense, see a future, they could see a sort of communistic future, but they were in no position to implement it. They couldn't, in a sense, envisage something which materially their society couldn't produce. The most that could be expected or could be understood was a very sort of primitive Christian equality, and it couldn't envisage the complete freedoms that in an industrial society would offer up potentially. So when Engels wrote about this, he was trying to say that they could grasp the future, they could see the future, but there was no way that they could achieve it. So that movement was crushed. It was crushed militarily. There was a counter revolution, and indeed, as we will see in other sessions, that sort of pattern of the rise of the movement and then its crushing will be quite familiar to us. The last small point I want to make is the end point that I put on the date, which is 1535, and this was in some ways something of an outlier, but it was always going to remain, I think, a sort of warning or a threat. And this was the Anabaptist revolt in northern Germany, in the town of Münster. And this again points towards the limitations of this sort of a millenarian communism. There's a novel called Q, which is a dramatization of these events. It's difficult to tell who the author is because it's by a mysterious collective called Luther Blissett. That's another story. But the picture that's painted of the Münster commune is rather like some sort of bizarre cult, a bit like Jonestown or even in some ways ISIS. It's quite horrific. And I suppose that's the point, that with these movements, this one led by Jan of Leiden, it was an attempt to create this new society, from nothing. And it very quickly became a theocratic, bizarre communistic experiment, which did have clearly a revolutionary push, but it was just because of the material conditions, but also because of its isolation, could never really develop other than a rather bizarre besieged cult. It was crushed. It was interesting in this period of religious division that both Catholic and Protestant armies joined together to crush this experiment. But what I think it shows is this problem that we've got. These early movements, in a sense, can imagine the future, but often their imagination is very much rooted in the world that they come from. And it's also an imagination that is limited by the material reality, that they can, in a sense, grasp the future, but they can't achieve it. And I suppose our inspiration that we can take from them is that they have that vision and they had that courage, to rise in revolt, to try and do something. And I suppose it's that inspired later socialists who took their inspiration from the German peasant movement and the English peasant revolt. Anyway, I'll conclude there and hand back to the chair. We can go for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Yes, what fascinates me is what's so incredible, actually, I think for me, is the spread of movements in an era in such limited, with such limited communication, limited literacy, limited in so many ways. They're able to organize despite the threat of capital punishment, despite the threat of loss, despite so many restrictions. Yeah, the bravery in these acts is quite incredible. It's outstanding. I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to make a comment, I believe.
Right. Okay, you got me now. Right. The point I wanted to make was about the effect of the Black Death, particularly in this country. A third of the population wiped out by the Black Death. It changed the class relations between the balance of class relations between the feudal overlords and the producing classes. And I think that gave. I mean, Kevin did mention this, but I think it's important. I think it's quite an important factor in the development of the peasant movements. I also want to sort of look at this issue of religion. At the time, the church was very, very, very insistent on maintaining the Latin liturgy and keeping it very much in the hands of the priests, who were obviously an adjunct of the ruling aristocracy. And it enabled the ruling class, all the time that the Bible, etc., were denied access was denied to the peasantry. They were able to focus on the duties rather than the egalitarian aspects of the Bible. Religion was a very, very important part of human existence at the time, and certainly sort of as translations became available, then that gave a bit of a fillip to those who were looking for social change. But I mean, going back to this question of the Black Death, I think that it wasn't just in Britain, of course. I mean, it swept the whole of Europe, but it certainly had a fundamental effect on the change in the balance of relations. Thank you.
Kevin, did you want to respond?
Yeah, ordinarily, Ben, I'll take a couple of questions, but I will respond. Yeah, I think, Mike, you're quite right about the Black Death, and I did mention the Statute of Labourers when I first came across that. It's so long ago now. I thought it was a prices and incomes policy, but it does sound a bit like it. I think also there's a psychological point about those changing in class relations, because the relative sort of shift of power towards the lower classes did improve their confidence, and the fact that they were often able to bargain with either the aristocracy or with their representatives, gave them that confidence. And I think the psychological benefit of that, it can't really be understated. One of the things about movements, and what I was trying to do was to demolish the idea that these movements just arose from oppression. I mean, there is a bit of an argument that that revolutions always occur when people are at their most oppressed. Well, I don't think that's always the case. It's when people feel that they can win. And one of the things about this period is that the lower classes did feel that they could win in that way. And there are a number of objective factors that you draw attention to that encourage that. I think the other point about religion is important because it's very easy for us to think of it as a false consciousness and to perhaps dismiss it. I mean, we live in a relatively secular world, and the power of religion we often tend to underestimate. We also, I think, underestimate the way that religious ideas and Christianity we would perhaps be familiar with, but you could see the same thing in Islam as well, I think, often have an egalitarian drive. So, the idea that we're all God's children, if we're all God's children, who gave you the right to be better than me? But the point you're making about the Bible and about the access to knowledge is also a very important one. And that was really very significant in Germany, because of course, in this period, the Bible is appearing in German. And indeed, it's been printed in an accessible sort of demotic form of German. Indeed, the Lutherans and indeed many of the religious radicals connected to the Peasant War had a very demotic style, and indeed, carried their ideas very clearly out to the mass of the population in an accessible way. So I think that does give people an ideological materials. I mean, I've got quite a few accounts here. I've got some of they're in translation, thankfully, of the German peasant manifestos, and although they're written in religious language, and indeed they've got sections of the Bible, they refer to Deuteronomy and Leviticus and so on. It's very clear that they've sort of broken through and they've seen, the revolutionary implications of equality that can be, that can lie at the heart of Christianity in this period. So I think, I think you've hit on two quite important points, and certainly that role of religion in Germany is very important.
Let me see, can I come back? Thanks for that response, Kevin.
Anne wants to speak, but she doesn't want her camera on.
Okay, Anne, do you want to turn off your camera? Okay, I'm going to pass to Anne.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry, I'm in bed with a migraine and not a pretty sight, so I'll spare you that. Okay, so thanks a lot, comrades and Kevin, for that introduction. I did actually study this question many years ago when we did a series in the CPGB on revolutionary moments. And what I found so interesting about it, and I think it was actually, there was revolutionary moments, and there was maybe perhaps another series very similar that we did, like about an alternative history. And as I was just going to say, I think what I found interesting about it and about tonight is locating that alternative history of struggle, you know, that plebeian history of struggle that we often aren't taught about in school, or else if we're taught about, it's very marginal to the, you know, the real history they want to impress on you, which is of the kings and queens and the leaders at the top of society. So I think that that's extremely important. And the second point I wanted to make was in relation to the issue of religion, because it seems to me that, like all of the discussions and the debates in society in that period of time would have been articulated through religion to some extent. I just wondered whether, like, you could perhaps comment on that, Kevin. I know you've already mentioned the strength of religion in Germany, but you know, it was way before a period of, like, there was no sort of concept of secularization in any sense in that time. And then finally, I really just wanted to ask you about the manner in which these histories were relied upon by later revolutionary movements. You know, the same way in which we today, we talk about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution spoke about the Paris Commune, and I believe the Chartists would have spoken about perhaps the levelers and the diggers. And, you know, again, I suppose that that's part of my main point about the like the history, you know, in which we place ourselves in, and the way in which that history is discussed and debated, and in which later movements relate to those earlier histories. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Shall I come back in, Ben?
Yeah, by all means, yes. Thank
Yeah. Okay. I think this point about religion that Anne's raised is an important one, and I think that you know, we can probably see examples of it in the, you know, in the modern world, of the way that the people utilize an ideology, you know, that is at hand. You know, just speaking from personal experience, I would have known, you know, when I was much younger, I would have known people who were, you know, fairly committed Christians who had developed both their politics had often come out of Christianity and had moved very far to the left. And I think that, you know, much of that was to do with the sort of circumstances in the world in which they lived in. And they took the ideology and they took the ideas that they had and attempted to, you know, to explain the world in that way. And I don't think that's at all unusual. I think that that's, you know, the way that, you know, the way that all human beings work. You know, very few of us sit down and think, I'll try and come up with a new ideology to explain the world. You take the material that you have, and then you often go quite a way beyond it. And when we know that Marx, you know, Marx is a good example of that. And indeed, you know, I think all great thinkers, you know, develop in that way. So as I said, we're not really just coming from nothing in that way. The inspiration that these movements had, I think, is interesting. And indeed, when I was, you know, doing a bit of reading up on this, I looked at whether there was a sort of popular memory of these movements. And one of the interesting things is that the Peasants' Revolt does feature in some following movements, Jack Cade's revolt in 1450, and there's also some evidence that the type of popular culture that's expressed in John Ball's speech, there's a sort of an oral tradition, you know, that is passed on. So that, for example, in the Elizabethan period, the Peasants' Revolt is mentioned in various plays, and there's a, you know, a sort of sense of from the ruling class of hoping that this is never going to happen again. But I think that that tradition is lost, and it's only really reborn, I think, with Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke in their debate that I referred to in the 1790s on the French Revolution. In fact, Burke makes fun of the Peasants' Revolt, and he makes fun of John Ball in particular, and Paine, you know, comes back and makes fun of Burke. Paine, as ever, gets better of the exchange, but, you know, then Paine's on the right side and Burke isn't. So he obviously is going to in that way. But I think that I think that what there is a sort of radical tradition, and I think John Rees will probably look at this next week, and that is an idea of the aristocracy as, in a sense, being alien. There's an idea of the Norman yoke, that the Normans were an alien aristocracy who come along and they subjugate the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons. So there's something of that tradition sort of hangs on, with the peasants being the freeborn Englishmen, as Lilburne might not have called them, and the Norman yoke. Although significantly, and you referred to the Levellers and so on, Lilburne does make quite a disparaging comment about the peasants, actually, the Peasants' Revolt, but I think that Winstanley makes much more positive references to it. I think also that there is an attempt in the period after the French Revolution to try to reclaim, if we to use the modern term, try to reclaim the Peasants' Revolt as a sort of, you know, our own version of revolution. So Robert Southey, who later becomes the poet laureate and quite a reactionary, writes poetry about it. And you know, I've referred to the Chartists, you know, naming themselves after Wat Tyler. I think what they were trying to do is to say, look, we've got a revolutionary tradition here, and we should, you know, we should try to reclaim it. I think the interesting thing in the German case is that because it occurs later, it occurs in a much more literate period. I mean, we've got masses of printed material, and indeed the peasant movement was so developed that it had, you know, formal organization of armies. It had forms of officers and committees. Indeed, it even had a traveling sort of government structure. So it actually issued decrees and, you know, gave orders. So we've got a much clearer idea of that movement. But the peasant movement is, I don't think it's quite as debated as, say, 1848 or, you know, other aspects of German history. But in Germany, there was an attempt to try to argue that the peasant movement represented a sort of bottom-up movement, and that the authoritarian traditions in German history, there's quite a debate about Lutheranism and the nature of the German bourgeois revolution. I mean, I'll look at that in 1848 when we get there. But in the DDR, in East Germany, there was an attempt to sort of reclaim the peasant movement as a, you know, a plebeian democratic movement, the democratic side of the Reformation, as opposed to Luther, the Reformation of the princes and the conservatives and so on. So in Germany, I think that it was part of mainstream historiography to discuss it. And then, of course, communists and others saw people like Thomas Müntzer, you know, one of the radicals, you know, as a sort of a hero figure. And of course, Engels picks up on that in his pamphlet as well, where he tries to talk about the division between the plebeian elements and the slightly higher class elements, who he's more or less hinting are the bourgeoisie, who will betray the revolution in the way they did in 1848. But I'm really going on a little bit further into the future there. Just one thing, which actually just reminds me about the inspiration of these things, is that I remember in 1981 going to an event at Blackheath, which had several thousand people at it, and one of the stickers, I think it might even have been the banner, it was a commemoration of the Peasants' Revolt, and it had, the slogan was 1381 to 1981, let's get the job done. Well, we didn't in 1981, but we've still got a bit of time left, yeah. So anyway, any other comrades want to come in?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to hand over to our next panelist. Panelist, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Oh, hi, yeah, Zbigniew Kluczynski, is that me? Yeah?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I had a question for Kevin. Going back to Jesus Christ chucking the Pharisees out of the temple over their support for cancelling the debt forgiveness, was referred to by the British revolts, because that still is something we need to do and reintroduce the cancelling of the debt under capitalism if we're going to get anywhere near to building a better society. So I just wondered if there's any of those movements asking for those kind of policies that were quasi-religious, economic in their nature. Okay.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I'll also pick up on a question, Ben, that I've seen in the chat line there as well. Zbigniew, my apologies if I've not pronounced that properly. The medieval Christian opposition to interest payments or usury was an important theme, and particularly the development of finance capital, which was in many of the southern German cities. I'm thinking particularly the Fuggers, the famous banking family from Nuremberg. They were often the targets of many of the peasant movements. So the cancellation of debt and the cancellation of various feudal charges was quite an important element there. So if you look at many of their demands, and in some cases they signed formal agreements with the landowners, and indeed in some of the towns, to have debt cancellation or to have the ending of various feudal dues and restrictions. They did make that quite an important point. It's also significant because money and market relations are starting to develop, so that, for example, many of the quote peasants would be small farmers, but they might also, many of the people who are involved in this movement weren't simply rural. Many of them would have been townspeople, many of them were artisans, indeed many of them were smaller landowners, and would be people subject to the problems of loans and debts and so on. So these were quite important points. In the English case, money relations weren't quite as well developed, although they were there. And actually it was quite significant that what they attempted to do was to destroy the manorial records, where there would be lists of obligations, for example, land holdings and obligations. For example, that if you held this piece of land, you would be obligated to carry out a certain service, or you might have to pay a certain rent or payment on it. So the peasants often attempted to destroy those records. That's a very common feature in peasant movements. Perhaps one of the most famous movements in the summer of 1789, the Grand Peur in France, did exactly the same things. It was almost a sort of belief that if you destroyed the written evidence, then the social relations that went with it would go as well. And you also get, related to this issue of debt and to obligations, you also get quite an opposition to lawyers, and who might well be intermediaries in these relations. They might be people who collected taxes, they might be people who are involved in the legal system. So the opposition to elements of the legal system and the imposition of debts and so on would be quite an important issue. I've got a question in the chat box there from Timothy Oxton. Tim, you talk about the class, you asked me about the class composition of the English peasants. Well, yeah, I think I did talk a little bit about it, but I think it's an important point. And at the beginning, I tried to say that peasants, we're largely an urban population in Britain. We've been for, nearly 150 or more years. In fact, more than that, probably close on to 200. So the rural, to use Marx's phrase, the idiocy of rural life, we tend to, and again, this is reinforced in popular culture, we tend to think of peasants as a fairly undifferentiated group of people. And in medieval times, we tend to think of life as being sort of short, nasty and brutal. I know it's a very old film now, but say the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, loads of smelly peasants and, really quite a barbarous life. Now, the people we're talking about here will, in many cases, be people who are not at the real bottom of that society. They might, for example, rent land. They might even own a certain amount of land. They might, for example, be skilled workers. They might even be small, landowners, tenant farmers in modern language. In other words, to call a movement peasant, it's a bit of a broad brush. And remember that to the upper classes and the people who are writing about them, the peasantry were a pretty undifferentiated group who were, in many ways not much above animals. And the idea that these people had any rights and so on, they couldn't really envision it. So the description of peasant is in some ways quite misleading. As in Germany, we know, for example, that people in London, urban populations, had sympathies with these movements. And we know from some of the trials that the people who are arrested and face charges are often skilled craftsmen. They're not, this is not a revolt of a blind rage of almost like an animal that sort of just rears up and is going to, it's going to strike back against its enemies. So I think your question about the, that the nature of these people and particularly the oppressions that many landowners, small landowners or people who rented land before is quite right. And there's also, I think, there will be other social distinctions, and you refer to, the Norman invaders. At this point, and it's quite an important turning point in many ways, linguistically, English is still the language of the mass of the population. The aristocracy speak French as their first language, but as you will know, Chaucer is writing the Canterbury Tales, I think, at the end of the 1380s, and he's, if you're familiar with Middle English, you'll be aware that it's now clearly a distinct language, which draws a lot from obviously the Germanic forms of English, but is also bringing in, you know, the courtly language of French. Richard II, for example, spoke French as his first language, but it's probable that the next couple of kings, certainly I think Henry V probably spoke English as his first language. And although French would be familiar, I think essentially we're moving towards you know, a different linguistic structure, which is going to be important in terms of how people you know, view the upper classes. So at this stage, we're just in this transition. So I think your point about them being seen as alien who speak a different language, I think is quite an important one in that way. Right. Yeah. I can just carry on. I've got a question from Carol Taylor, and she says that Christianity, I said that Christianity inspired the revolt, but did the established church work against it? Well, pardon me. Yes, in the Peasant revolt, the Catholic Church, which of course would be the church in England at that point, did work against it. The fact that the rebels executed the Archbishop of Canterbury probably indicates their attitudes towards leading religious figures. The church would have officially preached the idea that rebellion against rulers was wrong. God had created an order in the world with the king at the top, and that the aristocracy and so on. So this sort of social hierarchy was that divinely ordained. You know, very similar to the Victorian hymn. You know, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. Probably at the gate of the rich man, I should think. So, you know, so from that point of view, the official ideology was in opposition. And the same thing in Germany too. Although Luther led a revolt against the Catholic Church, he did so very much in terms of the established order. So he was backed by, you know, various princes and monarchs. He was indeed given protection by the elector, and he was, you know, he was very much an establishment figure. Although the danger, of course, is that once you question that divine order and you start interfering with it, then there's no way of telling where it's going to go. And in Germany, that led in extremely radical directions. There is another important point about the nature of the clergy, though, and it's something that's commented on, is that there is a large, what historians sometimes refer to as a clerical proletariat, and this is semi-employed priests. They've been formally educated as priests, but they can't get a permanent job. Many of them sort of do temporary work. This is almost like the 0 hours contract. They, for example, might well serve as a priest in a particular parish. And indeed, the phrase that's used in the Church of England still about a priest in a parish, the vicar, comes from the idea of a vicari in place of somebody. So what they're doing is they're managing the parish. They'll be saying mass, they'll be attending to the parish. It will probably be some elite clergyman who will be technically in charge of several parishes or livings. Again, the phrases are still used in the Anglican Church. And they will get the profits from the parish, which will go to them, and then they'll pay their clergy a pittance. So there was a lot of discontent amongst the lower clergy. And somebody like John Ball, for example, represents, I think, not only those people who intellectually are challenging Christianity, but also those people who, you know, have got a material interest. And this is, of course, is going to be the case in Germany, and it will be the case in the 17th century in England, in the quote Puritan Revolution as well. So there is a mixture of the material of this sort of semi-employed group of priests and people who've been educated, who've got no place in society, can see things are wrong in society, and these will in many ways be the figureheads and the leaders of these revolts. Okay, so I'll just stop now and see if there are any more questions.
Thank you, Kevin. One question I can pass on from one question I can pass on from Pam is do you have a reading list? And I'd also like to hand over to Ed and Mark, who've been waiting patiently as panelists.
Is that me first, Ben? Or
Ed? Yeah, by all means.
Well, thank you. Hello, I can hear someone else's voice. Am I okay to talk?
Yeah, we'll take questions from Ed and Mark, and then we'll hand back to Kevin. Thank you.
Well, I mean, thank you, Kevin, for it says start my video. Okay, if you want. There we are. There I am. Thank you, Kevin, for a very interesting and very informative talk. I was just interested in your description of the peasants' revolt from Essex and Kent, marching into London, coming into London. London must have had a significant sized population at that time. These were people who had real rural issues of poverty and inequality, and they were trying to get some justice the way they saw it. But London also must have had a lot of poor people, a lot of artisans, a lot of people working for wages, a lot of people, you used the term like being on 0 hours contract, a lot of job insecurity. Do we know anything about the reaction of the lower strata in, like, we can't really call them a working class in the modern sense, but the lower strata of, and what was their reaction? What did the peasant movement try and win their support? Did you see the point I mean, it's the earliest stages of what perhaps Lenin would have later come to see as an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. And I'm interested in trying to find out, if we know anything about what was the consciousness of the lower strata in London towards this movement. Thank you, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Ed. Just like to hand over to Mark and then give Kevin a chance to respond. Thank you.
Hello. I hope I'm on. Sadly, I missed most of the talk. The connection here has been pretty poor. Just want to make a couple of points. When you're talking about how history is often lost, there was at one point a very good mural of the peasants' revolt, which was put up on the 600th anniversary of it, and it was in East London, and it was designed by Ray Walker. Some of you may know Ray from his other work on the Hackney Peace mural. He died tragically young. The mural itself was removed, taken down in 2013 by the Tower Hamlets Labour Council, so thus removing the one sort of thing that did actually commemorate such a significant political social event. It was in 2014 when the removal took place, which was just after when Newport Labour Council removed its giant mosaic commemorating what had happened with the Chartists in the 1840s. This drive and determination by the capitalist class, which includes the Labourites, as is clearly demonstrated over the last 24 hours, to put it mildly, is such that in the history of taking working class people going back is such that unlike in European countries, in the National Portrait Gallery, there is no portraits of any agricultural workers. Agricultural workers, and by implications, and I do recognise the nuances which were made around the issue of peasants embracing all, are a group of people and others who are to be removed. And the result of that is that at the last election, Labour, and in previous elections, had absolutely nothing to say to rural workers, never has anything to say to rural workers. And the best books that have been written, for example, on the issue of land, Kevin Cahill's book, Kevin Cahill is a Liberal member. He was the agent for the previous military man who led the Liberal Democrats. So Labour has no position in these locations or areas. I would recommend one book. It was done by Martin Empson, who some of you know, a big SWP man and a very great student of rural communities. And his book came out. It was called Kill All the Gentlemen, Class Struggle and Change in the English Countryside, which looks at 12 or 13 episodes. My apologies, I can't really say much. I can't say anything about the rest of the talk. I'm sure it was fine, but for some reason the connection here has been very poor. All the best.
Okay, I'll respond to a couple of things that were said on the, in the chat rooms as well. I've seen for the reading list. Yes, I will produce one, and I'll also put some of these readings that I've got up, and I will also be doing a sort of smaller, little bite-sized recordings looking at some of these issues, particularly about the nature of the Reformation and religion and the whole debate on the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So I will look at that. Thanks for your question, Ed. I was just looking at one of the source books I've got, in particular one of the Chronicles, there were a series of trials held in London after the Peasants' Revolt, and they do give evidence, the trials give evidence that people inside the city cooperated with the rising. However, the difficulty that we have is that it's possible that, that some people were framed. And indeed, there was quite a factional struggle in the London government, the City of London government. And it's possible that some of the aldermen who were alleged to have opened the gates of the city and so forth may well have been framed. But the chronicle evidence that comes from the four main chronicle sources, particularly one called the Anonymous Chronicle, which does look as if it was actually written by somebody present inside the city at the time and had quite close links to the ruling circles, as it were. That does seem to point to the fact that the plebeian population of the city did join in. It's always a little unclear on these things, simply because we know that there were, particularly in continental Europe, but in medieval England as well, there was often a conflict between the town and the country. And although, as you say, London would have been a sizable city, I think its population is about 50,000. We'll need to check that. So it's quite sizable. And many of the people will, of course, come in from the countryside and, have links with the countryside. But I think that there might well have been tensions between the urban and the rural populations. Often their demands were different. And indeed, many rural people saw the problem as being the townies, who they might see as exploiting them. And that's often the case in many countries. It's a bit of an aside, but just to show you, in the 20th century, when troops were sent from Sardinia to deal with a strike in Milan, the Sardinian soldiers who were from rural backgrounds, quite poor, when they saw the houses of the Milanese workers, thought that they were, quote, gentlemen. Now, of course, those houses weren't palaces or anything like that, but the sort of urban rural thing is often, quite an issue. And as Ed makes the point, one of the successes of the Russian Revolution, which indeed was always going to be an issue in many parts of Europe, was how did you appeal to that rural population? And indeed, in Germany itself, there was something of a debate in the German communist movement in the 1920s, well, even in 1919, about the agrarian program. And of course, there was a similar discussion in the German Social Democrats about this issue. So the tension between the town and the country is always there. But I think the evidence does suggest a degree of support, but it's still unclear. That it's also possible that, as you would expect, that if an invading army comes into the town, then there will be some people who will see their futures lying with the new force. Some people will opportunistically join it. Again, we have evidence from the German peasant revolt of that sort of thing happening, of people who, out for the main chance. We also see people settling old scores. We see in London as well anti-foreigner movements. Some foreign merchants are attacked. And indeed, to link the two movements, or the two countries together anyway, we've got a letter in German by a German merchant who was in the city, which he sent back to Germany telling people what had happened. And that's quite an interesting source. So from that point of view, I think that there is some evidence of the movements coming together. On Mark's point about the rural, I think that there is a long history of rural struggles in I'll say in Britain, because of course in Scotland, and then when it was under direct British control in Ireland, there were very strong agrarian movements. But even in England, we've got the growth of trade unionism, and indeed I am old enough to remember when there were a number of rural seats. Thirsk in North Yorkshire was represented by Joan Maynard, who was a member of the National Union of Agricultural and Allied Workers. And indeed, in many rural areas, there was quite a strong tradition of militancy, often political militancy, because the powers, the ability of workers to organize in the countryside was often difficult. And of course, there's the big example, the one we should never forget, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, again, another group of rural workers. So I think you're right, Mark, and I'm certainly going to look up Martin Empson's book, because I think the countryside, again, we tend to sort of just think of it as a sort of bucolic haven, and it's very nice to go and visit and so on, but we don't, we forget it's also the scene of class struggles, and nowadays big agribusiness as well. And if comrades, I'm sure, are aware because of the Brexit debate, food production and the nature of that, there's a clear class struggle. Agricultural workers have some of the worst wages and conditions in Britain, and again, that our movement needs to organise and to confront that. Anyway, that's me finished for a while. Anyway.
Press you on a reading list. That was one of the questions.
I will produce one. I mean, I've got 6 or 7 books with me here at the minute, but I'll draw one up. Yeah. Thank you
very much, and thank you, comrades, and thank you, Kevin. This has been really, really enjoyable and informative. Kevin, you may have been a little too preoccupied, naturally, to have noticed some of the many, many compliments in the chat. So many people tonight have been grateful and looking forward to the next session. So comrades, please join us at the same time next week, where we welcome John Rees, back from his canal boating holiday, I trust. He's going to join us with his understandings on the levelers and the diggers in the English Revolution, 1640 to 1660 BC, before Corbyn. Comrades, we have been the Labour Left Alliance. Educate, organise, fight. Good night.